Hello and welcome to Middlebury Edition. I'm Middlebury Representative Robin Scheu, your host for the program. Middlebury Edition was created primarily for the purpose of educating folks about local services and the Vermont legislature, and to provide an opportunity for legislators and area nonprofit organizations to talk about their work. Today's guest is Representative Peter Conlon, who represents the towns of Cornwall, Goshen, Hancock, Leicester, Ripton, and Salisbury, if I have that right, in the Vermont legislature. This is Peter's third term in the House. He has been on House Education since he joined the House in 2017, and given his experience as a current board member and past board chair of the Addison Central School District, this is no surprise. Peter grew up in Montpelier and joined the Peace Corps after college, going with his wife Mary to Paraguay. He was a reporter and news editor at the Addison Independent for 15 years, followed by 10 years as a dairy labor specialist throughout New England. For the past 7 years, he has owned and operated Vermont Move Management and Home Inventory. He's also a member of the Cornwall Volunteer Fire Department. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Robin.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, and just mentioning your Cornwall Fire Department, thank you for doing that. There are articles in the paper every day about how there aren't enough volunteer firefighters. So.
Yes, and while our numbers are holding, our ages aren't.
Yes.
They don't seem to stay the same.
Darn. Anyway, thanks for your service there as well. All right, so let's get to legislative things. And first, let's talk about House Education, which is the committee you're on. What does it do, and what matters do you actually consider in your committee?
Sure. So House Education really talks about all things public school and sort of state regulatory, dealing with our pre-K to grade 12 school system, as well as a little bit delving into higher education with the state college system. And our sort of area of jurisdiction is the Agency of Education. And so we really deal with legislation that is designed about education law and education programs that our state run. So, for example, if there's money to be allocated available for the Agency of Education, we'd be the ones to do it, and we would design a specific purpose for that money, obviously working in close contact with the Agency of Education. We have one of the things we'll be doing this upcoming session is very dry, but it's going to be reviewing a certain set of statutes that need to be updated because they haven't been updated in a few decades. On top of that, there's a lot of sort of general legislation that comes to us having to do with schools for us to review, consider, debate, and then vote on. But really, it's our main focus most of the time is our pre-K to 12 public school system in Vermont.
Okay. So one of the questions I hear from constituents, and I imagine you do too, and you can clarify for this for me, what's the role you play in actually designing curriculum, if any?
Well, we play no role.
Okay.
And really, neither does the Agency of Education, one could say. We're very much a local control state when it comes to designing curriculum. The legislature does not get involved in that as much as some people would like to.
Yeah.
And then the Agency of Education sets education standards for all students in Vermont, but then it drops to the local level, and how those standards are met are really decided locally.
Okay.
So we are. It is. Curriculum differs district to district.
Yeah.
And in many areas, school to school.
Right. Okay. Okay. So that's left to local school boards and administrators to do curriculum.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay.
And under state law, every school district or supervisory union has to have that's where the sort of a centralized curriculum development program.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's good to know and get that clarified. But you have done some work related to certain sort of statewide potential programs and grant programs. And as you know, I sit on House Appropriations and Education. I'm the liaison to your committee for House Education. And the last session, there were a couple of big items, one around community schools and one around literacy. So literacy could be considered curriculum, but it's sort of more of a topic, and that's why that was okay to
so
do?
the literacy bill that we put together and ultimately passed and was signed by the governor, does what we often do in state government, which is allocate money.
Okay.
And so I think this was a $3 million program, and it was really designed to boost literacy in grades K to 3 in the state, because there's been lots and lots of evidence that we're falling behind, and that if you don't have kids reading on grade level by grade 3, that will hold them back thereafter significantly.
Yeah.
And so we really wanted to boost literacy education through the state, throughout the state, and this money was designed to help. And of course, it was made possible by the fact that we had some extra money to put toward this. And essentially, it allows, the idea is to have school districts around the state work regionally and really build a core of competence for literacy instruction throughout the state that can then spread on its own thereafter.
Okay. So in this case, it's not, it's about literacy and that children should be literate, but it isn't about what the specific curriculum is to get children to have the literacy skills that they need.
That's true. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about what literacy education works better, and we did our best to stay out of what they call the reading wars, whole word versus, phonics and phonemics. Yeah. But we did put some sort of minimal guidelines that really was based on science and based on recommendations from the field.
Yeah, yeah, that's where it gets tricky. I know education seems to be one of the more emotional subject matter that we deal with.
Well, we're all experts because we all went to school.
Right.
And so we all think it was great when I was there.
Right.
And so we all tend to rely on our own experiences.
Yeah.
We try to do our best to not do that and kind of stick with the data and the recommendations from experts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Wow. So you mentioned one thing about reviewing statutes, but what are some of the issues that will be facing House Education this next session starting in January?
There are quite a few things. What's interesting is that with COVID and with the fact that we created a couple of programs like you discussed just a second ago, community schools and with literacy, but with everything that's going on in schools right now and how we aren't where we had hoped we would be because the Delta variant really kind of threw us upside down, we've basically been begged by the Agency of Education and by the field to not come up with any new initiatives. So we're really going to devote a lot of time and energy to making sure those initiatives that are in place happen with fidelity. A bill that we passed, I think in 2017, called Act 173, is a major revamp of how special education is funded. That's got kind of a 5-year gradual implementation phase. We need to make sure that can happen or cannot happen depending on where we are. And then we've got a very dry rewrite of Chapter 11 of Title 16, which is really to update rules about union districts and supervisory unions that haven't been updated in decades.
Yeah.
And so we've got a number of lawyers working on that, and then we have to, even though we're not the legal experts, we still have to be the ones that review it and pass it.
Right, right, because we enact the legislation. So sometimes the best thing you can do is almost nothing.
Well, or I would say better to sometimes shore up and build a good foundation under those things that you've done previously.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like you've heard the pleas from the field.
Yes, and it's not surprising. This has been, we are. It's really hard to really grasp the devastation that the pandemic has wreaked in our schools, and they need the time and capacity to deal with their issues and solve their problems that are right on the ground and immediate. Yeah,
yeah. No, we've all been reading about the challenges that have happened in our school systems, and it's a really tough time. They don't need us to add more to their plate.
That's very true.
That's great. Well, one of the other things that you've been working on is you're a member of a joint House and Senate committee or task force, the Pupil Weighting Task Force.
Yes.
And maybe you could talk a little bit about why this exists and what you're supposed to be doing and how it's going. And
so I'll do my best to talk about it without going too deep in the details, because this has to do with our rather unique and complex education finance system.
Right.
And the way it works currently is we've got a population of students in Vermont, and that's sort of the baseline. And to those students, we add certain weights to recognize that they may cost more to educate. So for example, we add, if you have a high school student, you add a 0.2 to that to reflect that high school tends to cost more to provide than the lower grades. Same for students who require English language learning and students who come from an economically deprived background. So you take that, you add it to the number of students that you have, that creates what we call weighted students. Then there's a mathematical formula that brings that number back down to the number of actual students in the state, but those are called equalized pupils. So we use this term equalized pupils, and that's really the basis for how we fund education in Vermont, is how much we spend per equalized pupil. Well, those weights that we apply are decades old. No one really knows where they came from, and they've long been criticized by many across the state as not really reflecting the high cost of educating certain populations and the high cost of operating certain schools, such as small rural elementary schools or small rural high schools. So a study was done, commissioned in 2017 and was sort of given to the legislature in 2019 that really called for a major revision of those weights that we use. And so here we are, because the legislature moves very slowly, in 2021, finally having a group to look at this, because this is a sort of a major look at how we finance education. And it's really going to, if you think of the education fund as a pie that gets divided up based on the number of equalized pupils that you have, and then you shift where those equalized pupils are because of weights, you're redistributing the pie. And,
the pie doesn't get bigger, you're just redistributing who gets the pieces.
Exactly. And so how you go about that has been seen by many as unfair because it didn't reflect higher costs that are associated. Rural areas really argued that it's expensive to run smaller rural schools. And so we had a very scientific, peer-reviewed study that looked at these numbers. And then, so our legislative task force was to come up with a report that suggests a pathway forward to implement these. And because it is going to, as with all things, when you're not making the pie greater, you're going to have winners and losers. And so you're redistributing how the tax dollars go to different communities. And so ultimately that's going to have an impact on tax rates and property tax rates in particular. So we needed a task force to really look at the study, to ask questions. It's been several years since the study was actually completed, so it needed to be updated, and actually to act on and investigate some of the recommendations that came out of the study. For example, how do we define poverty? If we're talking about students from poverty, how do we define it? Currently, we define it as based on the number of folks who apply for food stamps. That really has been shown to not capture the real breadth of students living in poverty. And so we, for example, recommended moving to the free and reduced lunch numbers, and then ultimately to what they call a universal income statement, which would have every household with students in school fill out a form.
Regardless of income level.
Regardless of income level. And then that's how you can do it. Well, when you capture a lot more kids, that weight that is applied to students from poverty then gets sort of thinned out and distributed on a broader scale. And so the weights get sort of pulled from one area to another. So so we looked at the formula and how we come up with equalized pupils, and then we looked at the weights, and then come up with a number of different recommendations for the legislature to act on. It's pretty technical stuff. But it also, we had a broad scope to look through. So some of our other recommendations is to start really taking a hard look at moving education financing more towards an income tax.
Because really almost 2/3 of the personal property or personal payments to education finance is already on the income.
That's right.
Is it already income
Because
based?
we have what's called income sensitivity. And about 60 to 70% of Vermonters pay based on income and not based on property. We basically have an income tax. So this would make it an actual income tax. And we haven't said we have to do it that way. We've just recommended that we go that way.
And if I could also inject, there was, at the same time as you've been doing this, there was the governor created this tax structure commission And they recommended, one of the things they looked at was education funding, and they recommended moving to the income tax
That's right.
method as opposed to property tax.
Right, and one of the things that makes the income tax attractive is that it gets away from sort of district versus district property tax rates, and what one district does
Right.
affects another, and it really becomes much more tied, each person, to their own situation, to the school budget in front of them. They look at what the tax is, and so there's a much stronger tie between income, or between the budget that is passed and then the impact on your local
Right.
income taxes.
So right now it's pretty convoluted to get there, and it's hard for individuals to see that link. And this would make that link more direct.
It would, and it would, we sort of always look at, well, this district has this property tax rate and that district has that property tax rate, and you end up pitting district against district.
Right.
Whereas this would really just be a personal, how you decide on a
Right.
school budget or your feelings about it really just depends on your own personal situation
Yeah.
in that case.
Yeah, interesting. And then I wanted to ask you, I was watching some of your shows, I didn't watch all of them, but the phrase cost equity was coming up as part of that. Was that a different approach to looking at education funding?
Yes, it is, and it's going to require, kind of a new way of thinking by people. But so currently we use this equalized pupil formula
Right.
to draw down from the education fund, and so when you sort of come up with a new way to calculate that, what you're really providing communities who benefit from changes is not more money, but more taxing capacity. So if you all of a sudden go from 500 equalized pupils to 550 equalized pupils, your per pupil spending drops because I can't remember the
Right,
numerator,
the
the
math.
denominator changes. And so, and then your tax rates are then based on your per pupil spending. So it gives you taxing capacity. So a community can take that taxing capacity and choose to raise the revenue needed to provide students with the services that they need, but they can also decide to take that taxing capacity and provide property tax relief.
And reduce taxes.
And reduce taxes.
Okay.
What we have proposed for the legislature to consider is two paths. One, the traditional equalized pupil method, or two, converting those weights that we talked about into direct cash payments to school districts. And the reason that it makes it much more transparent, it makes it much more easy to understand, that basically you get, if you've got this many number of students who are from poverty, you get an additional payment per pupil from the education fund. Or if you have, if you are rural and small, you get a direct cash payment. And the idea is to say, what we want to see is money spent on these students so that all students across Vermont have the same opportunity. The idea here is not to provide property tax relief.
Right.
Now, one could argue all money is fungible, and sort of if you're getting money from one side, you can reduce it in another. But at least this is very transparent. It lets people know how much their school is getting. It's based on actual numbers of kids rather than this complex equalized pupil formula. And it's sort of just easier to understand. I think there are some fears about it that, in a way, it puts the legislature in control of the money. But I think you can write the statute in such a way that would sort of protect districts from the political influence of the legislature on how much money they get. And it's always important to remember that we have this system in Vermont where the state raises all the money from property taxes and lots of other taxes to fund school budgets that are all passed locally.
Right.
So the legislature doesn't control school spending.
Right.
Local voters control school
Right.
spending. Our job is to raise the money and then distribute it out.
Right, and that would happen still under this cost equity method. The schools,
That's right.
the local schools would still be determining their own budget. Nothing is changing with that.
That's right. That's right. And it's often referred to as a reverse foundation formula, because what you're really doing is, off the top of this big education fund, is you're paying those extra costs first, and then you are using the rest of the money to provide the per pupil funding, general education funding.
Yeah. So all of it's going to be a shift in thinking one way or another,
Yes.
and the pie still doesn't get any bigger no matter which way you do it.
Yes. And under either scenario, for many districts, this is going to represent a significant change positive or negative.
Right.
So we're certainly looking at, maybe a 5-year, we've recommended a 5-year phase-in
Okay.
of this
Okay.
because it's going to require some significant adjustments. And it's going to
Yeah.
require some very significant differences in viewpoint. This is really these are all our kids in Vermont viewpoint.
Right.
So we have to look at, districts who are saying what we really need is a turf football field, and then districts who are saying, we can't even field AP biology.
Right.
And so, it's going to be a hard adjustment for many. Even our own Addison Central School District comes out negatively in this because we are a high-spending, low-poverty school district, relatively speaking.
Right.
So, yeah, a lot of adjustments there.
Yeah. Yeah. So that makes sense. I mean, with other education acts, I know there's been sort of slow on-ramps or off-ramps to do it, and that seems to make a lot of sense. So,
Yes.
so the task force is going to have a report with some recommendations, and it will go to the legislature starting in January, who we hope this will pass this session. And is this going to House Education, or is this going to Ways and Means, or both committees? Or
It'll probably be divvied up.
Okay.
So there's some education policy that goes with it because as we sort of looked through this, one of the things we discovered is that, there's not a lot of oversight by the Agency of Education. It's a fairly short-staffed agency that mostly deals with distributing federal funds.
Yeah.
And we've got all these education quality standards, and we figured if we're going to come up with a new financing mechanism, let's also really look at how it is we assure that all of our schools are providing those services that we feel are so necessary for kids.
Right.
So that kind of thing would come to the education because we deal with education policy.
Right.
But what this is ultimately is a tax bill.
Right.
And so it will go to the Ways and Means Committee in the House or the Finance Committee in the Senate.
Yeah.
So it'll probably be divided up.
Yeah. Yeah. But we'll all see it sooner or later and have to vote on it.
Assuming that it can even make it out of committee because it's complex, but since we are in the second year of a 2-year biennium, it really has to.
Right. Right. Exactly. Because if it doesn't get through this biennium, by the end of our session in May, it all goes back to zero and we have to start all over again.
That's right.
So that's, there's motivation there to,
Absolutely.
to get that done. Okay, great. Well, thanks for explaining that. I feel like I understand it a little bit better now, so I appreciate that. So what do you see sort of, even beyond your House Education Committee, what do you see as issues that are going to be important for next session?
Well, I was speaking to some folks in Salisbury over the weekend, and one of the things I pointed out is that we're still somewhat awash in money, in federal dollars and in surplus tax dollars. About $600 million still needs to be appropriated from ARPA.
Right.
And then we have a surplus of state funds of about $188 million. And then the education fund has a surplus of about $90 million. Right. And so, we can look at these. This is one-time money, but one-time opportunities.
Right.
And so as I hear from people, and I think as we've all heard, there's no surprise that there's great pressure on a great many issues. We have a housing crisis in Vermont, and really you can't build even medium income level housing without some sort of government subsidy right now because of the cost of materials, the cost of labor, the cost of development. Housing is a problem. We've all heard about childcare.
Right.
We've got pressure on our pension system and many other things. Of course, some of this money comes with strings attached, so we can't necessarily throw it at anything we want.
Right.
But we need to appropriate that. I think it is an incredible opportunity. And then, of course, we've got another potentially $2 billion coming through the infrastructure program, to say nothing of the Build Back Better program, which we don't even know yet how much we're going to be receiving.
Right.
So,
and it has to pass in Washington first.
So definitely not complaining about actually having money to spend.
Right.
And not having to necessarily say no to everything.
Yeah.
And then, we've got, there are obviously those issues that money could be targeted toward don't go away. We've got, we all talk about we need a workforce, but you can't have a workforce without housing, and you can't have a workforce without childcare.
Right.
They're all interrelated. We've got needs in public higher education. So I think that a lot of that will come up. And then, of course, I think one of the big issues that we have dealt with to a certain extent, but there is definitely going to be a role for the legislature is continued work on the climate
Yes.
council report.
Right, right. That's a big one. And are you hearing some of these same things from your constituents these days, or what else are you hearing from your folks?
Workforce is a big issue
Yeah.
for employers. You hear it everywhere. You experience it everywhere. So I think that that's a big deal. Housing will continue to be a big deal.
Right.
There's really very little on the market right now, and there's
Yeah.
very little that anybody can afford. I feel it personally. I've got 3 sons who are in adulthood or about to be in adulthood, and I'd like them to be able to move to Vermont when they're sort of done doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
And but that's going to be one of my sons is a high school teacher, and to be able to find a house,
Yeah.
in Vermont near where he might want to work is going to be challenging unless things sort of shake loose,
Right.
or we get a lot more housing. It's interesting. I remember pre-pandemic hearing the economist Art Wolf say that because all of these labor shortages existed then, it's just
Right.
worse now. He said we need 10,000 people in Vermont tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that's going
And
to
we don't have 10,000 houses to give them either.
But that's
so
the problem.
That is a serious problem.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, we need to wrap up. The time has flown by, as always. People want to reach you. You've got your legislative email they can find on the website. And that's
right.
the best
And-
way to reach you?
Well, I'm old school, so I'm in the phone book.
Okay. There you go.
And if you Google my name, you can get pretty much my cell phone, my regular phone, my
Okay.
email. Yeah.
Great. Great. Thanks. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on the
Well,
show,
thank you for
Peter.
having
It's
me.
been great talking to you. That's it for now. My guest today has been Representative Peter Conlon. Thanks to MCTV for producing this show. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you next time.